Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall. Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall. Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall. Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall. Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall.
Hello, this is Sir Jedi Sentinel. It looks like we're heading for another lull in Doctor Who, so in the interim, I am going to try to find other content to fill my channel with. As you can see from the title, and probably saw from that opening video, I've had my first idea. Recently, I watched the anthology series Shelley Duvall's Fairy Tale Theater. If you're unfamiliar, Shelley Duvall, rest in peace, was an American actress, nowadays probably best known for her role as Wendy Torrance in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, but she was also known for her collaborations with director Robert Altman. Over the course of her career, Duvall pivoted to producing, and most famously produced 4 anthology series. Fairy Tale Theater was the first, and is still the most popular one. If you try to look around online, Shelley Duvall's Fairy Tale Theater is out of print on DVD, so all 26 episodes are on YouTube. That is how I watched it. If I remember, I will link to a playlist that I'm pretty sure has all 26 episodes. The episodes adapted, as the name implies, various fairy tales with big all-star casts. And like I said, I watched the series recently, I really enjoyed it, so I thought it would be fun to rank all 26 episodes. Originally, I was going to divide this into 2 videos, but since the algorithm seems to like long-form content lately, I decided to do all 26 as a single video. Once I'm done with this intro, we are going to pivot to voiceover and still images. Sorry, it'll essentially be a podcast. 2 reasons for this. One, because again, 26 episodes, so this is going to be a lengthy video. And, that way I don't have to sit here all day and try to record this in a single day for consistency. 2, I am, at the moment, suffering from bronchitis, so I am prone to coughing fits. So, simply put, recording audio rather than doing these as video is just easier to edit for me. Beyond that, you know how this goes. Everything presented is my own opinion. These are just how I feel about the episodes of Fairy Tale Theater. If you've seen them, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And like I said, because the DVDs are out of print, all the episodes are on YouTube. I do recommend this series. I had a fun time watching it. I do want to say, for people who have seen the series, there is a 27th episode. It's called Grim Party. It is a reunion special and clip show, so I am not counting it as part of this ranking. Alright, I think that covers all my bases, so let's get started with the list. Kicking us off at the bottom of the list, number 26. Episode 4, The Nightingale. This episode stars Mick Jagger, Barbara Hershey, Edward James Olmos, Mako, and Shelley Duvall herself as the voice of the Nightingale. This episode is famous for being the acting debut of the Rolling Stones' Mick Jagger, and infamous for the fact that he is in yellowface. Jagger receives a brunt of the criticism for being in yellowface, but watching this episode, everyone except Mako is. Barbara Hershey is, Edward James Olmos is. I think Jagger just happens to be the most pronounced because they also do the eye makeup on him, unfortunately. But yeah, everyone is, and it's a deeply uncomfortable watch. On top of that, the presentation of this episode, the pacing and everything, it's just really boring. All this episode really has going for it is just some stunning set design. It's just a shame about everything else. Number 25. Episode 6, Jack and the Beanstalk. This episode stars Dennis Christopher, Elliot Gould, Gene Stapleton, and Katherine Helmond. Jack and the Beanstalk's biggest problem is that it is way more ambitious than Fairy Tale Theater could pull off. Fairy tale theater is very low budget, and most of the time it works really well within those confines and comes off as charming. The closest comparison I could think of to make is classic Doctor Who. The effects aren't great, they're obviously produced on the cheap, but the show works with it in such a way that it comes off as effective and, as I said, charming. Jack and the Beanstalk is not one of those cases. You can tell how bad the effects look, and because it's trying to do effects it can't feasibly pull off, even on the cheap, it just ends up looking really bad. Number 24, Episode 7, Little Red Riding Hood, starring Mary Steenburgen and Malcolm McDowell. The biggest problem with this episode is runtime. Episodes of fairy tale theater run approximately 50 minutes. Now, normally when I criticize a story for runtime, it's because that story does not have enough runtime to tell it. You can tell when things are rushed or when plot points don't fully pan out, etc. Here, it is the exact opposite. This episode has too much runtime. You could tell the story of Little Red Riding Hood in about 30 minutes or even less. In fact, the actual story as it is the last third of this episode. And in execution, you can kind of tell that everything leading up to the retelling only exists to pad the runtime. And look, I like Mary Steenburgen, I really do. But if you've ever seen Mary Steenburgen perform, you probably know her for these very statuesque, very mature roles. So the fact that she is playing a character who is meant to be a child, I'm sorry, my suspension of disbelief just could not do that. That being said, Malcolm McDowell as the wolf is kind of the highlight of this episode. And when we get to telling the Little Red Riding Hood story, he is actually very menacing. Number 23, Episode 9, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. This episode stars Tatum O'Neal, Alex Karras, Brandis Kemp, and Donovan Scott. Hopefully talking about this entry won't take too long. This episode has a lot of the same problems that Little Red Riding Hood does, mainly that the time needed to portray this story is much shorter than the runtime of the episode, thus there is a lot of extraneous padding. That being said, what puts this above Little Red Riding Hood is Tatum O'Neal's absolutely unhinged performance as Goldilocks. If you really think about the fairy tale of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Goldilocks comes across an abandoned house, breaks in, eats these strangers' food, and sleeps in their bed. She's kind of a little psychopath, and O'Neal really plays into it like that. It's very funny. Number 22, Episode 23, The Princess Who Never Laughed, starring Ellen Barkin, Howie Mandel, and Howard Hessman. This one I don't really have a lot to say. Honestly, I just find it a little grating, close to being annoying. As the title suggests, or if you know the original fairy tale, this one obviously leans into comedy, and just the way it plays out, I feel like it's trying too hard. I didn't find anything funny, except for the brief cameo by Jackie Vernon. That was amazing. But there are seeds of greatness here. Ellen Barkin, as this princess who's been cooped up all her life, is really fun, as she reaches her breaking point and gets sick and tired of having to live within the castle walls. And she has a great scene with Howard Hessman where he confesses why he's kept her like that. But unfortunately, this one just doesn't land for me. Number 21, coincidentally enough, Episode 21, The Emperor's New Clothes, starring Art Carney, Alan Arkin, and Dick Shawn. This one is just really disappointing. Like, you have these comedy greats in this episode, especially Art Carney and Dick Shawn, and it feels like none of them are firing on all cylinders, especially Dick Shawn, who, if you've ever seen him in anything from The Producers to It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, or heck, even his vocal performance as Snow Miser in The Year Without a Santa Claus, you know he is way more bombastic and over the top than this. But he's very restrained in this performance, and the cadence of his voice and the way he's talking, It almost feels like this role was written for Robert Preston. But I will say there are some very interesting ideas here. For example, the charlatans, Art Carney and Alan Arkin, who in most retellings of this story are the antagonists, here they're the protagonists, and it gives the story this very eat the rich angle that I usually haven't seen The Emperor's New Clothes been given before. Number 20, Episode 19, Cinderella, starring Jennifer Beals, Matthew Broderick, Jean Stapleton, Eve Arden, Edie McClurg, and Jane Alden. This one, there's really no fault of it on its own. It's a victim of oversaturation. Whenever the entertainment industry goes through a fairy tale phase, traditional fairy tales, revisionist fairy tales, what have you, there is always a Cinderella adaptation. And honestly, this one is very bog standard. It just doesn't do enough to stand out. There are some good things here, Eve Arden, Jane Alden, and Edie McClurg as the stepmother and stepsisters, respectively. And Jean Stapleton steals the show as the fairy godmother. But yeah, there are just better adaptations of Cinderella out there. Number 19, Episode 2, Rumpelstiltskin, starring Ned Beatty, Shelley Duvall, and Hervé Villechaize. Like The Princess Who Never Laughed, I just don't have a lot to say about this one. Ned Beatty is playing against type from the types of roles he normally plays. Duvall is very charismatic and charming as the miller's daughter, but Hervé Villechaize as Rumpelstiltskin is kind of disappointing. He lacks Rumpelstiltskin's menace. And while I know English it was not Villechaize's first language, if you look at his other roles in The Man with the Golden Gun or Fantasy Island, he is still very eloquent. He's still very understandable. Here, I don't know if it's just the equipment or the sound quality or even the makeup, but he is very difficult to understand. Number 18, Episode 8, Hansel and Gretel. Hansel and Gretel stars Joan Collins, Ricky Schroeder, Bridget Anderson, and Paul Dooley. Hansel and Gretel is admittedly one of the better looking episodes of the show, but I attribute that to being shot on location. There is no way that forest was sets. Although that being said, the location footage, the audio isn't the best, and you can tell when they're on location versus when they're on a set, the difference in sound quality is very noticeable. Joan Collins plays a dual role as both Hansel and Gretel's stepmother and the witch. And while she has stellar makeup as the witch, her performance is kind of one note. And like Elliot Gould is the giant in Jack and the Beanstalk, there seems to be a disconnect between the performance and the script, because the witch in Hansel and Gretel is blind. That's how Hansel and Gretel are able to trick her in some aspects. Like, while the witch is trying to fatten Hansel up, he keeps using discarded bones to trick the witch into thinking they're his fingers, so she thinks he's not getting any fatter. However, Collins' performance doesn't suggest any of this. That being said, Ricky Schroeder and Bridget Anderson as Hansel and Gretel are two good child actors who, treating the material seriously, gives the story this sense of tension. Number 17, Episode 24, Rip Van Winkle, which stars Harry Dean Stanton and Talia Shire. Rip Van Winkle is probably much more noted for being directed by Francis Ford Coppola, with art and set design by his future Dracula collaborator, Eiko Ishioka. And the set design is probably the best part of this episode for me. Everything else just kind of meanders through until the point where Rip Van Winkle falls asleep. Harry Dean Stanton is normally an actor I like, but he's kind of just sleepwalking through this role until he shows up, also at the end, playing both Rip and a grown-up version of his son. After Rip wakes up as well, there's also a really fun appearance by Tim Conway. But yeah, Rip Van Winkle. This one's better for its set design and atmosphere. Also, I'm willing to wager that this episode served as a pilot to Shelley Duvall's follow-up series to fairy tale theater, Tall Tales and Legend. Number 16, Episode 1, The Tale of the Frog Prince, starring Robin Williams, Terry Garr, and Renee Auberjonois. While this episode is entertaining enough, it's also very rough. Rough, I think, is the best way to put it. Because The Tale of the Frog Prince feels more like a proof of concept than a fully formed episode. There is a lot here to like. Robin Williams and Terry Garr have really good chemistry. And this episode, being written and directed by Eric Idle, gives it a bit of an edge that the rest of the series lacks. I will never not find this hilarious. There is a scene where Robin Williams just straight up calls Terry Garr a bitch. It's great at showing the potential of fairy tale theater, but it doesn't ever fully live up to it. Number 15, Episode 25, The Little Mermaid, starring Pam Dawber, Treat Williams, Helen Mirren, Brian Dennehy, and Karen Black. The Little Mermaid is perhaps, I think, fairy tale theater's darkest, most melancholy, most mature episode. Even though this series aimed to tell fairy tales true to their original stories, a lot of those stories they would shy away from the darker aspects of. Cinderella's stepsisters don't suffer their punishment at the end of Cinderella. Similarly, even though we haven't talked about it yet, the Queen does not suffer her punishment in Snow White. And similarly, all of the sexual undercurrents are removed from fairy tale theater's adaptation of Little Red Riding Hood. But you can't do that with The Little Mermaid. If you're unfamiliar with Hans Christian Andersen's original tale, there isn't really a happy ending here. The Sea Witch tells the Little Mermaid that if she cannot get the prince to reciprocate her love, she will die. And while I'm skipping over a large portion of how this fairy tale plays out, that's ultimately what happens. The Little Mermaid dies at the end of the story. I also think it's a nice touch that this episode really leans into that. It's not saved as a reveal or a twist. Once the prince and the Little Mermaid meet again after she becomes human, you can tell he does not love her. And it lets the tale play out like this beautiful Greek tragedy. And that's all in the back half of the episode. Once you get past the absolutely unintentionally hilarious first half. Like Jack and the Beanstalk, this episode is probably a little more ambitious than what fairy tale theater could feasibly do. And that all plays out in this absolutely goofy first half of the episode, with all the ways they try to sell the undersea kingdom the Little Mermaid is from, particularly the wind machines they have blowing the actress's hair. It looks hilarious, but once you get past that first half to where the Little Mermaid turns human, it's actually really good. Number 14, Episode 22, Aladdin and His Magic Lamp, starring Robert Carradine, Valerie Bertinelli, James Earl Jones, and Leonard Nimoy. This episode is also notable for being directed by Tim Burton. And that is probably the most disappointing aspect of this episode. None of Burton's usual flair or style, back when he was better at this, is present here. There's maybe one scene where you get a little glimpse of that, but if you didn't read the credits, you wouldn't know this episode was directed by Tim Burton. I will say, as someone who was prior to this only familiar with the Disney movie, it was interesting seeing what liberties were taken with that adaptation. For example, in the original story, there are actually two genies, and James Earl Jones plays both. Or the Sultan's vizier and the evil sorcerer who covets the lamp, they're two different characters in the original story. Here, the sorcerer is played by Leonard Nimoy, and he and James Earl Jones as the genies are the best thing about this episode. Number 13, Episode 20, Puss in Boots, starring Ben Vereen, Gregory Hines, Alfre Woodard, and Brock Peters. Puss in Boots' problem is that it tends to get repetitive really fast. Puss will come up with a plan to benefit his master, he'll enact it, shenanigans ensue, he comes out ahead, rinse and repeat, and this plays out 2 or 3 times before Puss gets to the ogre. Thinking about it now in hindsight, the fairy tale of Puss in Boots is basically a Bugs Bunny cartoon. If you know musical theater, you probably know Ben Vereen most for his talents as a dancer, and he puts his entire physicality into the role of Puss. The costume work in this episode is amazing, as is the set design. But overall, this episode's kind of slow and again repetitive up until you get to the 3rd act, where Puss confronts the ogre. Oh hey, another coincidence. Number 12. Episode 12, Thumbelina, starring Carrie Fisher, William Catt, Burgess Meredith, and Conchata Ferrell. Going into this episode, I admit I was a little nervous. I was worried this was going to be another Jack and the Beanstalk situation, where this story was going to be too ambitious for this low-budget show to do. Thankfully, that wasn't the case. Thumbelina visually is a gorgeous episode with some of the best set and effects work in the series. The sparrow in particular is incredibly impressive. For a cast that features Conchata Ferrell and Burgess Meredith, Carrie Fisher really is the show stealer as the lead here. This episode comes partway through season 3. Now, in this ranking, I haven't really talked about the season breaks too much, where each episode comes from in each season and so on. But I do honestly believe seasons 3 and 4 are where fairy tale theater peaked. Number 11. Episode 14, Beauty and the Beast, starring Susan Sarandon and Klaus Kinski. The big issue with Beauty and the Beast is that while the goal of fairy tale theater was to retell these fairy tales as close and as true to their original versions as possible, Beauty and the Beast borrows heavily from a pre-existing adaptation. Spoilers, number 10 and number 9 on this list also do as well. I'm just saying that ahead of time in the hopes that I don't have to repeat myself. In Beauty and the Beast's case, it is a straight-up remake of the 1946 French film La Belle et la Bête by Jean Cocteau. And having seen that original French film, this episode loses so much. Why does the Beast show up outside the Beauty's room late one night smoking? And I don't mean smoking, I mean like he is lit, smoke is pouring from his body. Well, the original French film actually has an opening statement to explain and justify that. Why is all the furniture in the Beast Castle sentient? Again, the French film has an opening statement that justifies that this episode lacks. Beyond that, though, our leads here just have no chemistry. 1980s Susan Sarandon as the Beauty. Perfect, no notes, and out of everyone in this cast, Sarandon gives the best performance. And then we have Klaus Kinski as the Beast. If you know anything about Klaus Kinski as a person, make your own jokes here. But yeah, he and Sarandon have absolutely no chemistry here. This one ranks so highly more, again, just for a stellar performance from Susan Sarandon, and on the atmosphere alone. We have a third coincidence, number 10, episode 10, The Princess and the Pea, starring Liza Minnelli, Tom Conti, Beatrice Straight, Tim Kazerniski, and Pat McCormick. Going off of what I said in Beauty and the Beast about how numbers 11, 10, and 9 in this list seem to borrow from other adaptations rather than telling the true original, quote-unquote, version of the tale, The Princess and the Pea appears to borrow heavily from the musical Once Upon a Mattress. Not in that any songs from the libretto are being used, but more in some of how the plot beats play out. The fool and the prince wanting to help the princess pass the queen's test, the queen being a bit of a smother. I think in part this is because The Princess and the Pea is once again a very short story that would not fill a 50-minute episode. So padding it out like this is a good way to help fill that runtime. And it's not as bad as Little Red Riding Hood or Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And thankfully, Liza Minnelli and Tom Conti have a really good chemistry together that helps sell this episode. Number 9. Episode 5, Sleeping Beauty, starring Bernadette Peters, Christopher Reeve, Carol Kane, Beverly D'Angelo, and George Zunza. As I had talked about in number 11, this is the last of those 3 episodes that seem to borrow heavily from a pre-existing adaptation. In Sleeping Beauty's case, it's the Disney movie. Which, as much as I like this episode, and we are in the top 10 now, so these are what I think are the best episodes of the show, that is the most disappointing aspect of this episode. First of all, this episode also similarly only tells the first half of Sleeping Beauty. Yeah, if you're unfamiliar with the original fairy tale, after the prince braves the briar patch, goes into the castle, and awakens the princess with a kiss, that's only the halfway point. There is a whole other story. There is a whole other half of Sleeping Beauty that needs to be told. So much so that some scholars believe it's actually a separate fairy tale, but we're not here to have that debate. The other aspect of Sleeping Beauty that this episode borrows heavily from the Disney movie, the Wicked Fairy. In the original Sleeping Beauty fairy tale, after being snubbed an invitation to the princess's christening, the Wicked Fairy shows up and curses her that she will prick her finger on the spindle of a spinning wheel and die. And that's it. That is all the Wicked Fairy shows up in the original Sleeping Beauty tale. And of course, the Disney movie builds her up to be a major antagonist. The Wicked Fairy in this episode similarly encases the castle in a briar patch. In the original fairy tale, because it's been there over 100 years, it just grows naturally. And when the prince cuts through it, she faces him in the form of a dragon. Or what fairy tale theater can pull off in the form of a dragon. The confrontation between the Wicked Fairy and the prince in this is spectacular and hilarious. But the cast is really what sells it. For my 2 cents, all episodes of fairy tale theater have had spectacular casts. But I think Sleeping Beauty is one of, if not the best casts in the entire series. Bernadette Peters is adorable as the princess. Christopher Reeve is the quintessential Prince Charming, and he and Peters both have really good chemistry. George Zunza is funny as the narrator. Carol Kane as the good fairy is Carol Kane. If you're into that, which I am, you'll have fun. And Beverly D'Angelo just steals every scene she's in as the evil fairy. Number 8. Episode 11, Pinocchio. Starring Paul Reubens, Carl Reiner, James Coburn, Lainie Kazan, Michael Richards, and Jim Belushi. Pinocchio as a 50-minute episode was going to be interesting because if memory serves, it's not a traditional fairy tale in that I believe it's a novel. I'm not that familiar with the original story. All I could tell you is that compared to its more famous adaptation, Pinocchio kills the cricket. And the cricket is not in this episode. So it'd be interesting to see what gets cut and what gets kept. But this episode does a really good job of hitting the beats that everyone knows. The cast all around is absolutely stellar, and Pinocchio, I think, has the best sets in the show. Number 7, Episode 13, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, starring Elizabeth McGovern, Rex Smith, Vanessa Redgrave, and Vincent Price. I'm gonna be honest, I think Snow White is one of the dullest fairy tales to adapt. I don't know if it's oversaturation like Cinderella, or I don't know if it's even in those periods of the entertainment industry doing revisionist fairy tales, taking the classic tale and putting a spin on it. There's not really a lot you can do with Snow White. I don't know what it is about Snow White that just doesn't land with me. So, how did this adaptation reach number 7 on this list of 26 entries? Well, there's a couple reasons. First of all, there's the score. I haven't really talked about music or score in these episodes. I've said this before in my reviews. I'm not musically trained. So for me to comment on the music, it has to really stand out for good or bad. And the score for Snow White really does stand out. It's very atmospheric and lends itself to the story being told. The other thing that puts this episode so high, Vanessa Redgrave as the Queen, who's almost playing it like a drag queen, and Vincent Price as the Magic Mirror. Especially when the two of them play off each other. They are spectacular and give this episode so much rewatchability. Number 6, episode 26, The Dancing Princesses, starring Leslie Ann Warren, Roy Dotrice, Peter Weller, and Zelda Rubinstein. Adapted from The 12 Dancing Princesses, though this story only features 6. So admittedly, The 12 Dancing Princesses is not one of my favorite fairy tales. In fact, it comes off to me as being kind of misogynist. The endings for the princesses plays out more like a punishment than an ending, than a happy ending. Not to mention them being made a prize. So I honestly think this adaptation does a lot to fix the issues of that story. In particular, over the course of the 3-day trial, the prince gets a chance to get to know, befriend, and bond with each of the princesses. Similarly, the king learns more about his daughters and bonds with them and makes amends for his own mistakes. It's just a very heartfelt episode, and like Snow White, I couldn't help but notice the score. There's this recurring leitmotif for the princesses that's really pleasant, for lack of a better word. I'm sure I had a better word in my head and I can't think of what it was now. Also, it's just fun to joke. Peter Weller, who plays the soldier here, made this episode the same year he made RoboCop. Number 5. Episode 3, Rapunzel, starring Shelley Duvall, Jeff Bridges, and Jenna Rollins. This adaptation of Rapunzel is told in 2 halves. The first half is, of course, the candlemaker and his wife. At the behest of his pregnant wife, the candlemaker sneaks into the garden of their neighbor, a witch, and steals radishes for her to satiate her cravings. When he's caught by the witch, she decides to spare him in exchange for their daughter. Their daughter who will grow up to be Rapunzel, and of course the second half is the Rapunzel story. Jeff Bridges and Shelley Duvall have good chemistry, but interestingly, I think they excel at different parts of the story, and that just might have to do with them having different material to work with. Jeff Bridges is better as the candlemaker than he is as the prince, and conversely, Shelley Duvall is better as Rapunzel than she is as the candlemaker's wife. But of course, the show stealer here is Jenna Rollins as the witch, and just across this entire series, it's very clear the actors playing the villains are just having an absolute blast, and they are the most fun to watch. Whether it's Jenna Rollins in Rapunzel, or Vanessa Redgrave in Snow White, or James Coburn in Pinocchio, or Leonard Nimoy in Aladdin, the villains in this series are such a blast. Number 4, The Pied Piper of Hamelin, starring Eric Idle. There are 2 notable versions of The Pied Piper of Hamelin. There is, of course, a tale attributed to the Brothers Grimm, and then there is a version of the story that was told as a poem by Robert Browning. This episode is adapted from the poem. In fact, the narration and the dialogue are stanzas of the poem, which is just such an interesting way to do it, and in the larger scope of fairy tale theater, helps make it one of the most unique episodes in the series. This is also the darkest episode of fairy tale theater, which I kind of talked about this more when I talked about The Little Mermaid, because you cannot avoid what's happening in this story. Eric Idle completely transforms into the title role of the Pied Piper. With the help of what I think is one of the best costumes in the entire show, none of Idle's comedic wit or charm is present here. He's slightly unsettling from his introduction, and that sense only builds as the story reaches its horrifying crescendo. This is one of fairy tale theater's, no, this is fairy tale theater's darkest episode, and it's one of its best. Number 3, episode 17, The Snow Queen, starring Lee Remick, Lance Kerwin, and Melissa Gilbert. Going into this episode, I had high hopes, not just because this episode is from season 3, again, fairy tale theater's peak, but also because The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen is my favorite fairy tale. And while I don't think this is the best adaptation of The Snow Queen, this episode does not disappoint. I particularly like how this episode includes aspects of the tale that other adaptations try to omit or rework into other parts of the tale. Notably the stuff with the mirror. If you know the story of the Snow Queen, you know what I'm talking about. It's also a fairly unique decision to have the Snow Queen in this episode be much more benevolent. In the fairy tale, she is the main antagonist. Here, though, recognizing what the Shard of Mirror is doing to Kai, she takes him with her in the hopes of saving him. I do wish the script gave Lee Remick more to do. It seems like all it does is have her sit or stand around and look glamorous. But she does work with what she has, but really, Lance Kerwin and Melissa Gilbert are the stars of this one, as Kai and Gerda. They have really good chemistry, and they so strongly commit to their roles. Number 2, episode 16, The Three Little Pigs, starring Fred Willard, Stephen Furst, Billy Crystal, Valerie Perrine, Doris Roberts, and Jeff Goldblum. So again, like The Princess and the Pea, like Little Red Riding Hood, like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, we have a case of a story where a 50-minute runtime is too much time to tell the story being adapted. Unlike those other episodes, however, the extraneous material in The Three Little Pigs actually works for me in a way that the extraneous material in those other examples didn't. Here, it's actually funny. I don't know if it's the cast, which is just full of comedy greats, or I don't know if it's the writing being strong or what have you, but this episode works for me in a way that, again, those other episodes where it was clear that the runtime was longer than the time needed to tell the story, didn't. Yes, even though the show is called Fairy Tale Theater, this episode really just has a stagey quality to it that the others don't. And as someone who is a fan of theater pro shots, I really like that. The costumes are really fun and very theater. And again, just this cast. You have Billy Crystal, Fred Willard, Jeff Goldblum as the Big Bad Wolf is amazing. Yes, it's just him doing his usual Jeff Goldblum shtick, but he steals every scene he's in. If I was to recommend a single episode of Shelley Duvall's Fairy Tale Theater to watch for the first time, it would definitely be The Three Little Pigs. And what do I think is the best episode of Shelley Duvall's Fairy Tale Theater? Number 1, episode 15. The Boy Who Left Home to Find Out About the Shivers, starring Peter MacNicol, Dana Hill, Christopher Lee, David Warner, and Frank Zappa. So if I haven't brought it up on the channel before, here's a fun fact about me. One of my favorite actors, if not my favorite actor, is Christopher Lee. So I automatically became this episode's target audience. And just pairing him with David Warner, absolute perfection. I also like how this episode leans into the comedy a premise like this creates. If you hadn't heard of this story before, which I hadn't, kinda, that'll be my closing thought, this story is about a boy who has never felt the sensation of fear. That's what this story means by the shivers. So he ventures out into the world to discover fear, because everyone else around him has felt it, yet he never has. In his travels, he comes to an inn where he finds a king, or was it an emperor, who has been run out of his castle, which is now haunted, and the emperor promises riches to anyone who can brave a night within its walls. Now, obviously, a boy who has never felt fear, encountering these things that are supposed to be frightening and not understanding why people are scared, that's a recipe for shenanigans. And again, this episode leans into it. It also makes me kind of sad that Christopher Lee never got much of an opportunity to flex his comedic chops, because he is absolutely hysterical in this story. Really, the only criticism I have about this story doesn't even have anything to do with this story. As fun as it is, this is actually not my first time encountering this story. Prior to watching Fairy Tale Theater, I actually watched another anthology series about folklore and tales, Jim Henson's The Storyteller. And that series also has an adaptation of this story. That episode is called Fear Not. And as much as I like this adaptation, the Storyteller version is just so much better. But that's not this episode's fault. This is still pretty spectacular. And there you have it. What is your ranking of the episodes of Fairy Tale Theater? Have you seen it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, click the bell to get notifications when I upload, and in the description box below, you'll find a link to my Bluesky, where you can follow me and get updates on the channel. This is Sir Jedi Sentinel, and I'll see you guys next time.